Hello, today we're going to be talking about Farewell, N's Farewell from Pokémon Black and White. N's Farewell is a very popular song from the game, and that's for good reason. It represents a lot of the progressions and ideas from the Japanese pop idiom, and because of that, it has a very attractive, very easy to listen to sort of harmonic palette. That's the A section, and as we can see here, we have a tonic function chord going to this weak dominant function chord, and then this deceptive movement to 4, and then minor 4, and then we get flat 7, which is a nice little change up there, and then flat 7 goes back to 1. However, this opening progression outside of pop music is extremely controversial, and I'm going to talk about why. I'd call it the most misunderstood functional concept in music theory in its entirety. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that it's just not that common of a situation. And when you do see the situation, a lot of teachers don't know how to deal with it and don't know where it comes from. So here's a guy named Heinrich Schenker. Heinrich Schenker is one of the thinkers that many American theorists pull from. I'd say he's the dominant thinker in American music theory. And the reason why is his students went to America and taught in America, so a lot of people teach Schenker in America. And he had this idea called the quintiler. The quintiler was a way of thinking about the 3 chord as a way of connecting 1 and 5. Now, the more time you spend with music, the more you realize that this is not a very good concept, because 3 is like a weak version of 5. So moving from 3 to 5 is like moving from light green to green, which spoils the arrival of green. But the whole point of the quintiler is that Schenker was looking at Bach, who would do things like this, and he wanted a way to explain it, so he came up with this concept, the quintiler. In practice, it's not a very useful term, and it's not a very musical thing to do either. I think the majority of people who play piano know that this is not a very, your hands don't want to do it because it's such a weak movement. And another reason why it's a bad idea to call this a quintiler is because it moves to 4, it doesn't even move to 5. I mean, eventually it does. Schenker often looks at large scale things. So, I mean, we go. We get our 3 chord. And then we get our 5 chord all the way at the end of the second line. He would probably say that if he was going to make the argument that this is a quintiler, but I don't even think Schenker would call this a quintiler. One aspect of the quintiler is that the 3 acts as an extension of the 1. Right? The 1 and the 3 kind of form a unit, and then we get the 5. This would make these G minor chords tonic function. And that's problematic because it misses the point of the progression. The progression here is a 3 moving to 4, which it is in itself a deceptive motion. And it doesn't really matter what context it's in. Whenever you have a 3 moving to 4, it feels deceptive because the 3 chord naturally wants to proceed to 6. Because 6 is a tonic function chord and 3 is a dominant function chord. If you called these G minor chords 3 chords that are tonic function, then you have no regression, which means you can't have any deception, because a deception is an allowed regression, at least when we're talking about minor third relations, like we are in my functional map, the one that I use in all of my videos. Like, here's the relative relations on my functional map, for example. But these relative relations don't come from Schenker. They actually come from Riemann. And Riemann was another thinker who is much less popular in the US, but his books did get translated to Japanese, which makes me think that it's much more appropriate to be talking about Riemann than Schenker when it comes to this style of music. And he came up with 3 relations. Parallel, which is just turning E flat major to E flat minor, right? That one's pretty straightforward. But then there's 2 other relations. There's the relative relation, which is all over my diagram, and there is the leading tone exchange relation. And to give an example of relative relation, on my diagram on the left, you see the 4 moving to flat 6. They're very similar, and how Riemann thinks about it is we take the 4 chord and we move the bottom note down. For a major chord, you move the top note up, but he moves the bottom note down. And the reason why he does this is he thinks that there's an overtone series, but he also thinks that there's this undertone series, which is kind of like the reverse. And he thinks that in minor key, you go down, and in major key, you go up. They call this theory dualism, which has been debunked pretty hard. But I think the musicality of Riemann's system has kind of kept it alive. It's definitely much more musical than Schenker's conception of music, which has made it popular regardless of its foundational principles not being that scientific. As we see, here's the 4 to 6. We have the 1 to 3, which is also shown. And we have the 5 to 7. And this R relation that's circled is transforming all of these chords into these minor secondary chords. So we have minor primary chords that are being turned into minor secondary chords using the relative relation. And as we can see on the diagram on the right, we have 1 becoming 3, we have 4 becoming 6, and 5 becoming 7, all moving down by 1 note. Now, Schenker actually had a very similar idea about this. He called them remote fifths and nearby fifths. So Schenker understands the relative relation. It's just like not as important in his system because he comes up with all these exceptions to the rule. But Riemann came up with a second relation which kind of reverses it. So in major keys you go down and in minor keys you go up. For example, the 1 chord, you go down and you get an E minor chord. And here's another example of a tonic function E minor chord. It would just be derived from a different relation, not the relative relation, but the leading tone exchange relation. So he'd call this a tonic function chord going to the tonic leading tone exchange, or the tonic light tone Wechselklang, which he probably would have called it because he's German. And then to the subdominant, which is kind of like our blue, our predominant in our system. But the problem here is that, again, we lose the regressiveness of the 3, which sort of undermines the underlying progression. If it's not red, then it can't deceptively move to 4. This wants to go here, but it doesn't. It goes here, which is deceptive. The Japanese treat underlying progression as king. And a lot of this comes from the fact that they got a lot of their Western understanding from popular music. So let's look at things that happen in popular music. We have this 4 to tonic progression, right? Or in a minor key. these are very common progressions, 4 to 1 6 and 4 to 3 6. But what if this 3 chord is just a substitute for the 1 6? Instead of that, we have the problem with this reading is that the 4 comes after the 3. If the 4 came before the 3, this would make sense, but I don't like to do back relating harmony because I think it's unnecessary. You don't need it. It doesn't improve the analysis at all. And even if you have to call this a tonic function 3, it's at most a secondary function because there's still a desire to go to 6 after this. And I mean, look at the beginning of the B section. We end up going to 6. So whenever we have a progression with a 3 in it, we're always eventually going to go to 6. This is something that's weirdly consistent. If you look at any music that has a 3 in it, it usually goes to 6 eventually. Because the 3 just has such a desire to go to 6 that you can't get rid of that. It's going to come back eventually. Now, if you know jazz, you're probably saying, yes, but what about What a Wonderful World? This is a talking point I hear all the time at music theory conferences and all this. The 3 chord can't be just dominant function because what about What a Wonderful World? Well, I say that this is 3 to 4, but what about this? So in What a Wonderful World, we have... Isn't it funny? We get 6 eventually. Talk about that more in a second. But here we have the 1 chord, 3 chord, 4, 3, and then it goes back to 3, right? And then we get 2, 1, and then we tonicize 6, right? So from my perspective, we have a deceptive cadence, 1 to 3, and then 3 goes to 4, which is deceptive. And then we go back to 3, and then 2, and then 1. So this 4, 3, 2, 1 is a Sonic the Hedgehog. It's a Sonic the Hedgehog, which in itself has this regression from 3 to 2. From 3 to 2, 3 to 2. You're usually not allowed to do that. But that's because the Sonic the Hedgehog has a kind of weird origin progression. It's a circle of fifths progression. If you take a circle of fifths progression and you get rid of every other chord, and then you get this. So a Sonic the Hedgehog is just a circle of fifths progression with a bunch of chords taken out, with every other chord taken out. And so this 3 to 2 isn't actually a regression. Because the 3, if it goes to 6, now there's no regression. The Sonic the Hedgehog is a simplified version of the circle of fifths progression, and those chords show up implicitly because pop music often reduces things to its most fundamental or most simple presentation, which is what's going on here. But look there's 2 3 chords here, and eventually we just have to go to 6. So here's another example of going to 6 when we have 3 chords. You can't avoid it. You're going to go to 6 if you use a 3 chord. And then another cool thing about What a Wonderful World before we move on is after the 6, then we chromatically move down in a slide progression, which is wonderfully Japanese. It's a very Japanese sounding thing. Okay, I hope that makes all the jazz people happy. As we can see, even if we look at What a Wonderful World, there's not really enough evidence to say that the 3 chord is tonic function. And as a result, I'm still going to call this red, which is going to piss a lot of people off, but I'm still going to do it. So most theory teachers teach that the 3 chord is both tonic and dominant. Now, I mean, think about that. The tonic function is supposed to be stable, and the dominant function is supposed to be unstable. So how could a chord be both stable and unstable? Well, some people would say, well, it depends on context. But I don't think that's true. I think that no matter what you do, if you use a 3 chord, it creates some sort of instability that needs to be resolved. The 3 chord is a weak 5 that wants to go to 6 instead of 1. That's it. That's really all the 3 chord is. And yes, it can go to 4, and yes, it can go to 2 in the context of certain progressions, but those progressions have functional explanations for them. And we don't need to say that the 3 chord is tonic function. Now, a lot of people still want to say that the 3 chord is an extension of 1 in those contexts that I showed. And that's fine if you want to call it a secondary function. But I wouldn't teach the 3 chord is primarily tonic function. It's sort of confusing to a student, and I think it's demonstrably wrong. I just wouldn't do it. My soul doesn't want to do that because it feels way more confusing than it needs to be. The 3 chord is just dominant function to me. Now, with that long-winded explanation over, we should talk about this cadence because it's really cool. It's a money chord. If you know popular music, you know exactly what this means. So usually it's major 4, minor 4, 1, right? This movement. Probably heard this a million times. It's the emotional sort of sounding chord that appears in so much pop music. But the Japanese often substitute it for a 7/7. So what Kageyama is doing here is he's using the 7/7 from the Japanese money chord in addition to the 4 from the normal money chord. So 4, minor 4, and then you get kind of a surprise Japanese money chord before the resolution back to. And then we get a tonicization of 6, which then moves us to the B section, which sounds like this. Yeah, that's a great B section. It builds up so much energy for the return to the A section. It starts out with this chromatic lament. And then after that, we get a 4-5-1. And then we land on 1 and get a 2-5-1 of flat 6, which is the most anime progression of all time. It's so anime, it's ridiculous. It's the soul of Japanese music, and all the black gospel music people just cheered in the audience. And then after that, we get this 1-4, which is really bright. It comes from Dorian. And then from 4, we go to 4, which is like another money chord, right? But instead, we don't do a money chord resolution. We do a predominant dominant chain with skipping at the end. And then we skip all the way up to D flat, which gives it so much energy. We're so ready to resolve to E flat. It's wonderful. It's a great predominant dominant chain. It brings us up a minor third. The point of a predominant dominant chain is usually to modulate up a minor third, which is what it's used for here. Because we were in 6, right? We went to 6, and then we stayed in 6 for a while, and then we used this predominant dominant chain to get us out of the key. Some might say that we didn't modulate at all because the key of E flat major and C minor have the same notes, the relative keys. But we got so much going on in C minor that it doesn't hurt to analyze it in C minor. And this predominant dominant chain at least guarantees that we're out of C minor now. We're back in E flat major, because the predominant dominant chain is the greatest signifier of a modulation up a minor third in Japanese music. It's such a strong resolution. And then we get the reprise of the A section. And then we quickly go back to C minor with that tonicization. It's the same tonicization that we used before. It's a 5 of 6. So once we get to 6, get a lot of E flat. It's a lot of E flat in the bass. We get this kind of descending figure. And then 5, and then it goes to 1. No, it doesn't. It goes to flat 6 at a deceptive cadence, which is kind of like we go from 2 to 5, which is kind of like skipping at the beginning of a chain. And then from 5, we go to flat 6. And then it's like skipping at an end of the chain. And now we're all the way on flat 2, and then flat 2 goes to 1. If we're going to kind of put that on the minor third grid, we go over almost the entire minor third grid with this progression. 2, 5, flat 6, flat 2, 1. It's a really cool progression because it really uses most of the minor third grid. We go from 2 to 5, so we'd go all the way up to B flat, and then we step up to C flat, and you would expect it to go here, but it doesn't. It goes here, and then it resolves here. So we go all the way up to flat 2 and then to 1, which creates a really dramatic resolution. And that really ends off my discussion of Farewell, or ends Farewell. I love this piece. It epitomizes a lot of Japanese popular music and the way that it works. If it wasn't for Ghibli music popularizing the 2-5-1 of flat 6, I'm not sure that it would be as popular as it is in the idiom today, but definitely that sound has been so entrenched in Japanese culture that you kind of can't get rid of it now. And that's why it shows up in stuff like Pokemon and in these sappy sort of farewell scenes. So that's really it for this video. Thank you for watching. I have a Ko-Fi. Donate to my Ko-Fi. Buy my charts, which are also on my Ko-Fi. Join the Discord, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks so much. Good evening.